If I had to pick the sonnet that made me fall in love with sonnet form, it would probably be this poem, Facts by Thomas Carper. It's a modern sonnet and a very interesting one that sort of like made me pay attention to the form of sonnet for the first time. I loved the content, the tone of the poem, and I just thought, my goodness, I didn't know that such an old-fashioned form of poetry could be so powerful. The poem is a classic modern sonnet in that it hides that it's a sonnet. Most of its lines are enjambed, and so I call it a hidden sonnet. If I read it wrong, you'll hear that it sounds kind of weird, and by reading it wrong, I mean that I'm going to pause at the end of every line, as an end-stop line would be, just like Shakespeare would do, and you can hear the rhymes, but the poem loses its smoothness. So this is how it reads wrong, right? Facts by Thomas Carper. It is important that a son should know his role and should be told the woman's role, and know it is effeminate to show emotion or the least lapse of control. You can hear that, like right here, the pause makes sense because there's a comma. He should be told the woman's role. And so that pause makes sense. But when I pause at know and show, we realize that, that doesn't quite read the poem correctly. Instead, we just have to fly through it. This, of course, is the technique of enjambment. And modern sonneteers tend to like the enjambed line a little bit because I think rhyme is a little bit embarrassing. It's a little bit too la-di-da, a little bit too Shakespearean, although I think everybody secretly loves rhyme. If I read it without the pause, you can hear that it's one long speech. We also notice that Shakespeare likes to break his sonnets into nice quatrains or octaves and sestets. But here, if I find the syntactic units, or basically the complete sentences in the poem, we can see that almost nothing falls at the end of the line. He hides his sentences ends inside all of the lines here. Almost nothing ends with a completeness. The only place that it really definitively ends is at the end of the poem. This poem is a lyric poem, meaning it's just sort of a speech. And we learn that it's the voice of a son describing his father's parenting methods. And we can see, the first question we should have asked really is it Shakespearean or is it Petrarchan? This is a perfect Shakespearean sonnet in rhyme scheme. It is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Let's just read the rhymes. No role, show control. Man love, began reprove. First heard, worst word, die cry. That die cry, both of those kind of negative words and heavy words because they rhyme right beside each other and at the end of the lines. And we start to understand why the way a poet ends a line can be so important, a poetic technique for having a certain effect. Now, the title of the poem is Facts. And one thing I've always loved about this particular poem is that kind of describes the tone of the poem. It begins factual, sort of speech-like, I would say objective. There's a sense of proclamation as well, where we have that sort of empty it at the beginning of it. What does it refer to? It doesn't refer to anything. It's just sort of a grand way of starting something like, it is important that we do this kind of stuff. You get the idea that the speaker is imitating the kind of things that he would hear from his father. The father is, in this poem, a man who is raising his son with the traditional, sometimes constricting, some people call it the man box, traditions, notions of masculinity, that a man should never show emotion, no matter what, even to those he loves. I feel like the father is probably a little hyperbolic, a little bit exaggerated. I can't imagine a father being this hardline about masculinity with his wife and with his children, but it's certainly conceivable. So the poem does what a lot of sonnets do, which is it begins objective. A lot of modern sonnets do this. They start with something sort of external and out there, and then as you move through the poem, it gets more intensely personal as it goes. Sometimes you look for the I. You look for the speaker of the poem. Where do they show up in the poem? And that kind of indicates, the movement of the poem. And of course, we're looking for the volta as well. Because this is a modern sonnet, it doesn't fall between the 8th line and the 6th line. It actually is hiding right here in the middle of a line. A very non-showy volta, although of some great power as we move into the more personal of it. The other thing that indicates this is a modern sonnet is that it is not real showy in terms of alliteration, although it's there. It's not decorative like a jewelry box, like Shakespeare wanted to make his poems. It also doesn't like show off its metaphors and similes. It almost reads like everyday prose, and I think that's what impressed me about it so much, is that I didn't know that he was following meter. I didn't know that Thomas Carper was following a rhyme scheme. I just felt the power of the poem, and then only later upon reflection realized how beautifully the poem was written. So let's read the first kind of half of the poem, which is the father's sort of proclamation, or at least the son imitating his father. Facts by Thomas Carper. It is important that a son should know his role and should be told the woman's role, and know it is effeminate to show emotion or the least lapse of control that might mean caring for another man, even a father. Now, we've mentioned this punctuation, right? The musical notation of the poem. I love the dash here at the end of this line. You were not allowed to show, notice that there is decorative stuff, like least lapse, might mean. There's places where he's sort of sneaking in what we'd call some decorative alliterative effects. But he says, a man is never supposed to show emotion, especially when it might mean caring for another man, dash, even a father. This is a pearl clutch moment for me. This is like, I'm like, what? You can't even tell your dad you love him? And then the dad actually does speak. I think this is sort of mock imitation, although done very well because it is deadpan, it is stone cold, it is factual. He's not really playing his mockery big there. He's just letting his father speak for himself. Never say, I love you, I was told. I can't imagine a child being told this, but notice the word, the phrase, I love you, maybe the three most important words in the English language, being broken up by the line break right there. So he was told, never say I love you. If ever tears began after an argument, notice the three A's there. If ever tears began after an argument, he would reprove me mockingly, only fags cry. Now that's a word I don't hear very much anymore, and I'm glad I don't, because it's such an ugly word. But the whole poem is built on that, right? The idea that this young boy, when his father was teaching him what a man should be, he'd never even heard this pejorative term for homosexuality and mockery there. So when he heard the phrase, only fags cry, the boy heard, only facts cry. He makes this clear in the sort of little background he provides in the next lines. And notice that there's a lot of pain in the word first, implying that the boy was told this a lot. The first time he said this to me, I misheard the slangy phrase, but knew my tears were worst of possible betrayals. Yet that word stays with me, and when my father shall die, no man will weep, because only facts cry. What a powerful poem. What a powerful use of that couplet there. It's one of my favorite endings of any poem, because we can see that a lot of how we read the tone of that last line is up to how we perform the poem, right? When it comes alive, poetry is really something that's supposed to be said rather than read. It could be that at the end of this poem, he is very angry. Oh, my marker turned red for some reason. But he's very angry with his father for the emotional damage he did. This is not good for guys and not good for women, for men to be out of touch with their emotion. It could be that he is numb, that he is dead inside, that he can't feel anything. He is his father's son. And when his father dies, he doesn't weep because he was taught not to weep. That's the logical working out of the father's ethos of parenting in some ways. So it can be angry, it can be numb inside, it can be unbelievably sad. Like, I am unable to connect with my father. I am unable to feel sad for him because my father would not allow me to feel sad for him. So this poem is not what I would call a really poetic poem, in that it's like shiny metaphors and similes and personification and all sorts of funny things happening here. Instead, it reads like a genuine speech, but it is magically in iambic pentameter and in a perfect Shakespearean rhyme scheme. Where does it begin? It begins with cold stone factual objectivity and ends with a variety of tones that you can just sort of make the argument for, and I think all of them are persuasive. But obviously the most important word in the poem might be facts or fags, whichever one of you wanted to talk about. And when I look at this poem and I ask myself, what is this poem? I would say it is probably a lament. A lament for a father who damaged him emotionally and made him unable to be fully human. We could maybe call it a critique or an indictment of his father's cruelties. I'm sure his father maybe had his reasons though, but sometimes things work out sadly, don't they? But one of my favorite sonnets from the modern era.